Just before, Andreas, you lay out what I will use as shorthand, namely the Future of Education and Skills 2030, let me just ask you a couple of questions so that people get a sense of the nature of the work that you are leading in OECD in Paris and globally. Most people immediately think of you and PISA. Just before we do you and PISA, yes, what actually brought you to the OECD? And without, I mean, many people might like to hear your entire life story, but just in a snapshot, the kind of trajectory that took you to that place that now has you leading the education enterprise of OECD and advising on all education matters for the Secretary General. Just how did you get there?
Actually, my background is very different. I studied physics and I worked in medical research, and I was hired by the OECD to design a framework of indicators for education, and that's where I started. But I very quickly realized, if we do not study the outcomes of all of this, knowing how much we spend is not getting much further, and that's how I went into this field.
So let's just fast forward, because PISA now is a kind of a global phenomenon that people either embrace or feel is a major challenge for them. A word about how you see PISA as an enabler of what we might see as a stronger learning system that I know you're going to talk about.
Yeah, I think what PISA allows, it creates a mirror in which we can see ourselves in light of what everybody else is doing. And PISA never tells you what you need to do, but it tells you what everybody else has been doing and with what success. And I think that's really been missing in the field of education, where education is very inward-looking. Teachers work in the classroom, schools work in isolation, and education system as well. And I think that's been the idea to help us look outwards, see how the world is evolving in the field of education and create a global space for educational discourse. And the fact that people started to travel to Finland or to Shanghai, is an outcome of that. That suddenly you see there are different ways of doing things in education.
A quick word about the way in which you see PISA evolving. I mean, already there are now new innovative domains. It's not just a question about literacy, numeracy and science. Is that, Andreas is not as loud as he could be? Okay, fine. So just a sense of how you're seeing the kind of immediate next few years.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. We see that the world is rapidly changing in the kind of knowledge, skills, and character qualities that are valued, and we need to become better in building those into our metrics. So, for example, in 2015, we tested collaborative problem-solving skills in PISA. We were actually criticized for this. People were saying, we don't teach collaboration, so you are unfair to our children assessing this. But in fact, it's the category of skills that has seen the most rapidly rise in demand on the workforce. We're working on the assessment of global competences, the capacity of people to see the world through different perspectives, lenses, understand different ways of thinking, different cultures. Again, this is not only at the workplace, but in life, one of the most fundamental challenges. Or working on an assessment of creative thinking. That's perhaps more intuitive, but I really think our metrics of success that are hugely influential in how students learn, teachers teach, and schools work need to reflect the dimensions of demand better, and we're trying to do that.
And just one final point, and that is people are now talking about the future of education and skills within the international community, and they're adding on the 2030 agenda. It's true that international bodies like UNESCO, World Bank and others have always been in this game of thinking about that future. Obviously the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 is now the agenda that we're all tackling one way or the other. But what is it that led to you determining that this was the kind of investment that OECD should make? And what do we really talk about here? What is it that a 2030 Future of Education and Skills agenda is?
I think the 2030 framework of the UN, I think, is the global overarching framework. But, in order to make that real and tangible, we need to bring that to people. And that means to put numbers to this and to make it measurable, make it observable. And that's really where the OECD is trying to add value to this discussion, finding ways how we can actually, observe progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And clearly, the skills and education dimension is absolutely central. Our schools today are going to be not only our economy tomorrow, but our society tomorrow.
Do you mind then laying out the imperative of education, the economy, politics? You've got 15 minutes to do it in. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to move across to there. But I do think that for all of us, it is an agenda about learning for all, lifting Australia's learning productivity. You've made comment about that, and learning a living. So if you can lay that out for us, we'll then get, post our first course, a reaction from our invited guests, and we'll open up the floor for wider conversation. So, colleagues, would you please join me in welcoming Andreas Schleicher.
Yeah, I want to just sort of start with portraying. One of the things that we do at the OECD is simply track educational progress. And, we haven't started that now. We started in the field of science to do that in 2006. And when you think back to the year 2006, it's a long, long time ago. It was actually the year before the iPhone was invented. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river. Many of the things we take for granted today did not exist in those times. And actually, when you look at the capacity of students to think like a scientist, that's actually been pretty much unchanging in a rapidly changing world. And 2009, maps became dynamic, cars were electric, and driving without a driver, lots of things happened. Very little change in the way in which students learn, teachers teach, and education progresses. In the last 3 years, it's amazing kind of changes. Robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics, all of those fields have evolved. And again, very little progress in educational outcomes. Now, students learn a lot more stuff, but when it comes to their thinking skills and reasoning skills, we have not seen real change. There are exceptions to this. You can see a country like Portugal moving upwards, or Singapore moving from good to great, but they are really the exceptions, not the norm. If you look to Australia, started out really well. It's still a high-performing system, but it's the wrong direction of travel. In part because PISA puts an increasing premium on those kinds of higher-order thinking skills. And if you just take sort of a look forward and look at the impact that digitalization has on everything, really. It's not just work, it's life, how it's hollowing out workplaces. It's incredibly democratizing. It allows everyone to take part in our lives, but it's also incredibly concentrating powers. If you think about Google making $1 million per employee, 10 times the average American company. This is what is actually happening, creating mass without scale. Digitalization, incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard anywhere, but also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness, empowering those people with the right skills. You do not need a factory to build something great. You need a great idea, and you can actually do it. But it's also disempowering for those who do not have those kinds of skills. So this is how, in a way, digitalization is amplifying human talent. And this is just, the surface. There are lots of other dimensions of social change that have made this world more volatile, more complex, more ambiguous. And in this world, knowledge is expanding exponentially, filled with all facets, and all of them relate to people. And this world of school is really only a tiny part of that. And what we're trying to do is, of course, everybody wants to have everything in this little box. And when you try to do that, actually, what is a pity is that many of the rich facets of our world actually end up as very shallow shadows of themselves. You look at fourth graders in school, they're all enthusiastic about science. They love science, experimentation, observing things, finding cause and effect. You look at this at age 15, at the PISA age, and students hate science because we have made these kind of shadows that are just, formulas, equations. And the reaction is, we've just put more and more things into this box. That's really, I think, what happened to our instructional systems. I'm saying this because in one way you can say the instructional system in Australia has become a mile wide, but very thin. And that's something, if you ask yourself, what is going to make us different from technology? It's, the realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, civic and political life, those kinds of design, creativity, those are the dimensions that actually are going to help to pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the human qualities. So let's have a look at some of those dimensions. What have we learned actually? High-performing education systems, strong cognitive demand, expect all students to succeed, there's no tolerance for failure. They teach fewer things, greater depths, and they have very coherent learning systems. They remain true to the disciplines, but encourage interdisciplinary thinking. That's a tension that's very, very important, not giving up the rigor, the ways of thinking of a scientist, the ways of thinking of an historian, of a philosopher, but at the same time enabling young people to see the world through different lenses. Focusing on things that enable students to do new things. If you teach students, what you enable them to get into your footsteps, but not to find their own way. So this is, I think, very important, transfer value. Teaching things in ways that are real. Authenticity, a very important dimension. And keeping in mind that, we are talking about skills for the 21st century. A lot of that has to do with not just, what you know, but character qualities, values. And those things are often not taught in learning systems. So those are the challenges. At the OECD, Tony mentioned, our work on 2030. We have basically created a framework that looks at, what you know, what you can do, but also the attitudes and values that enable you to mobilize your cognitive and other resources. So we look at 3 classes of competencies, creating new value. What do you add? Taking responsibility, taking action, and also dealing with the kind of tensions and dilemmas that come from our societies. That's sort of it's quite similar to your general capabilities framework. So this is the idea. What do we see in the real world? We surveyed teachers, and this is what we found. Almost every teacher in Australia says, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. And you say, well, that's really how things should be. 80% say students learn best by finding solutions on their own. 70% say thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. Isn't that just what we were looking for in the 21st century? But, the reality looks a bit like this. If teachers in Australia would do what they say, they would not do much rote learning in classrooms. And this is sort of a scale of rote learning. You would find Australia sort of at the bottom of the table, but this is already taken by Switzerland, And then comes Poland and Germany. In fact, Australia is there. Teachers say, we have a very constructivist view on pedagogy. That's the reality. Had I asked you at the beginning, which country comes out on top, and I heard this actually today, China, rote learning country. Actually, there's a little bit of memorization going in China, but not that much. Singapore, Japan, Korea, they do some memorization, which is a very important tool for learning something, but it's not the dominant pattern. If you look at the counterpart, what about deep reasoning, intrinsic motivation, critical thinking, creativity? Again, China does memorization, but they're also very, very good on that spectrum. That's where the reality in Australia is quite different. And I think this is something very, very important. The intended instructional practice, the beliefs that we have, may not materialize. And we have to ask ourselves what lies behind it. This is just sort of putting this in numbers. This is the incidence of memorization. Now you can say, is it good or bad? We've studied that actually. And I want to sort of highlight this in one way. If I'm putting in the green part, tasks where memorization helps you, and in the red part, tasks where memorization actually hinders you. And you can actually see when you order tasks by their difficulty, the more complex the tasks get, the less helpful is memorization. So in a way, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are the kind of things that actually are becoming less relevant. They're easy to digitize. So this is really one of the fundamental challenges that we see. When you look at the counterpart, students' elaboration strategies, thinking out of the box, connecting to new fields of knowledge, That's what you don't see in the classroom. And as you can see, actually, that's what is the predictor for really performance on tasks requiring creative thinking, complex reasoning, and so on. That's the challenge, really. It's not just doing more of the same, doing better on everything. It's really about shifting the instructional paradigm towards the kind of 21st century skills. And in a way, teacher beliefs are already there. That's what teachers say they're doing. But in effect, the reality looks very different. And what are the transformations that we see behind this as we move from the kind of bureaucratic kind of system to the modern enabling system? First challenge is that sorting is no longer good enough. In the past, when we worked in industries that only required fully well-educated workers, sorting was very efficient. Today, where you need everybody to succeed and where the penalties of low skills are huge, that's no longer working. Think about social inequalities. That's a big phenomenon in most industrialized nations. We can no longer deal with this through redistribution, using taxes to take money from the rich, giving to the poor, because the pace of change makes that impossible. We have to start to do better on the sources of inequality, and you come very quickly to the skills of people. Now, is this an abstract idea? No, it's actually something that is happening in some nations. Some countries have become very, very good in leveraging the talent of all people. Second point, I mentioned already, moving from, things that are easy to teach, easy to test, towards more complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working, collective capacity, social skills. And that requires a very different caliber of teachers. That's the struggle of this. Now, that's not doable in the kind of factory, industrial-style school systems that we have. It really requires high-level professional knowledge workers. And the trouble is that they don't like to work in the kind of Tayloristic work organizations that we often offer. And it requires different forms of accountability, where it's much more important to whom do you relate and how do you relate to this. Couple of slides just on showing you some data. Let's start with this idea, moving from sorting to actually developing the potential of our learners. Is this possible? Things like PISA get immediately criticized that, you're comparing apples with oranges and different contexts and cultures and so on. So let's take a list out. We can actually look at student learning outcomes by decile of social background. Now, the red square there is the performance of the most disadvantaged students in the Dominican Republic. The green triangle, the wealthy ones. Big kind of achievement gap. People look at this and say, well, poverty is destiny. We always told you, it's much harder to educate children from disadvantaged families. Right. But let's see how people with those kind of characteristics perform in other countries. And what you can see is actually that similar students from exactly the kind of same social backgrounds come out so differently depending on the country in which they go to school. You take the 10% most disadvantaged students in Vietnam or in Estonia, and these are not the wealthiest nations, and you can see they do as well as the average student in Australia or the industrialized world, and they do better than the 10% wealthiest students in all of Latin America. I think this really shows how education can do so much to leverage talent from disadvantage, and that poverty is not destiny. Now, the first question is, how do you get there? And easiest answer, Rob mentioned this, is money. It's always easy to put the problem to someone else. And actually what you can see, money does make a huge difference up to a point. But, Australia and most OECD countries are already well beyond the point where just spending more of the same is going to give you better results. We only explain about 8% of the performance variation of countries, of OECD countries, simply by spending per student. How you invest your resources, that is the big predictor. As soon as you factor that in, how do you balance, different spending choices? The second part is, how do you align resources with needs? How do you attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? In the green part of the chart, you see countries that are good at that, that are basically either mobilizing more resources in disadvantaged areas, that's the blue dot, or that even attract the more talented teachers and the more challenging kind of schools. But you can see you find only very few countries that have actually been good at aligning resources with needs. Most of our countries are like Australia, where actually, you know, if you come from a disadvantaged background, we're also going to give you the less qualified teacher and the poorer resources. So most of our educational opportunities actually reinforce social background. And that is sort of the promise of education, is the big equalizer. The reality is often, you know, come out worse and more unequal than we go into education. And that's also not only inequitable, but it's also ineffective. Because, you know, the way, if you want to improve learning outcomes quickly, you focus on the most disadvantaged. If you come from a wealthy background, you have many open doors in life, your schooling doesn't make that much of a difference. And school doesn't make that much of a difference in terms of performance. If you come up from a poor background, you have only one card to play in life, and that is a good schooling. That's where actually education can add most value, get the biggest rate of return. But I think in 2030, we need to become much, much better at using resources where they make most of a difference. It's hard to do with financial incentive. Most countries that do that well work with career incentives, building careers through disadvantage, through taking on challenges and so on. But you can see a lot of work to do on this. How do we move from a system which is just hierarchical, you know, tayloristically organized, to one where actually there are incentives for people to collaborate across the system? Let me just show you one chart on this. On the vertical axis, you see the student-staff ratio. That's basically the number of teachers you're giving for every 100 students. On the horizontal axis, you see the class size and the number of students in a class. And now you might think, well, the two should be the same. If I have more teachers, I can make my classes smaller. No? But you can see actually countries are all over the place. The two are actually unrelated. I'll show you an example. China and Australia. Both are equally generous in the number of teachers they put to every 100 students. But China has a much larger class size than Australia. And you say, what's going on here? Well, the answer is, if you're a teacher in Australia, you have relatively little time to do anything else than teaching, because a small class comes at the cost that you have to spend more time in the classroom. If you're in China, you teach between 11 and 16 hours per week, but you actually work longer than an Australian teacher. What do you do in the rest of the time? Well, actually, you spend more time with individual students, you spend more time with parents, you spend a lot more time in professional development. Once per week, you observe somebody else's classroom. Once per month, you take part in a teacher competition. There's a lot of investment going into this that make you own your profession. You are expected not only, you know, to teach your students, but also to advance your profession. Two countries spending the same, spending resources in very different ways. And when you actually look at this more systematically, you come to the most high-performing countries, whether it's Finland and Europe, Canada and North America, or the East Asian countries. When they have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they go really systematically for the better teacher. How do you move from the kind of prescriptive systems that worked really well in the past, you know, telling people exactly what to do and how to do, to a system where you actually, you know, put your emphasis on knowledge in the front line? This is sort of the tragedy of the kind of old system where we try to always put things on top and we hope that it trickles through. We're discussing today, you know, of course, you know, initial teacher training is a really, really important thing to do. Developing, attracting highly qualified people in the profession. But you only change about 2-3% of your workforce by that means. The rest of the people will stay there. And the world keeps changing. And that's the answer, therefore, is, you know, when fast gets really fast, being slow makes you quite disoriented very quickly. You know, as a teacher, you confront things that are totally unknown to you. And that's where sort of building sort of more knowledge at the front line, more continued development is important. Have a look at this. You know, we ask teachers whether, you know, being more innovative in their teaching is going to be recognized, rewarded. And 3 out of 4 teachers say, no, my school is pretty much an innovation-hostile environment. No. That is something, if we do not change their perception, nothing is going to change easily. No. In the past, you know, the divided everything up, student by subject areas, destinations, and so on. The question is how to move to a more integrated system where students learn, where we remain true to the disciplines, where we encourage interdisciplinary thinking, where we are integrating the world of work and the world of learning rather than dividing people up between academic and vocational programs. That's the challenge of our times, building kind of incentive structures that actually work towards more integrated, more immersive, more real environments. How do we move from teaching everybody in the same way to understand that students learn differently and differently at different stages of their lives? Huge kind of challenge that is confronting teachers in many countries now. How do we move from a system that is predicated on standardization and compliance, these kinds of norms of the industrial work organization, to a system that is really fostering entrepreneurship, ingenuity at the front line? Recognizing that learning is not a place, but it's an activity. That's something that I think we have still a lot to do on this. Technology is going to be part of that equation, but have a look at this. On the horizontal axis, you see the intensity of technology use in the classroom, and on the vertical axis, learning outcomes. And I'm choosing the learning outcomes that are most susceptible to digital technology, digital literacy. And what you actually see is a little bit of technology seems to be conducive to better literacy, but the OECD countries are already well beyond that point where technology has a positive impact. And you ask yourself, how can this be? Every sector of our society has been transformed by digital technologies. And somehow in our schools, it seems to do more harm than good. And the answer is, we have 21st century technology, we have 20th century teaching strategies, and a 19th century work organization. And that does not work together. And I think we lack the kind of pedagogies of the 2030 framework that really enable us to use technology in more productive ways. Now, if students sit in a classroom and copy and paste things from Google, yes, you get worse outcomes than teaching in the most traditional way. And actually, this is an area, I think, which is a good illustration how far the reality is away from the promise. Moving away from prescription to have this kind of informed profession. Just sort of a couple of points. It has to do with professional knowledge, professional autonomy, but also collaborative culture. When we looked at, what drives actually genuine professionalism in countries, several things come to mind here. One has to do with, the public confidence in the profession, the social status of teaching. And you ask yourself, it says cause and effect, Very good question. Professional preparation and learning. Collective ownership of professional practice. This morning I was giving an example. In Shanghai they have a digital platform where teachers can upload their lesson plans and projects and ideas. And the trick of that platform is that it is combined with a reputational metric. So the more other teachers go to download your lesson, criticize your lesson, improve your lesson, use your lessons, the more points you get in the system, like on Facebook, like on eBay, like on all of this. So actually, these metrics build trust. And at the end of the day, your school principal will not only ask you how well did you teach your students in the class, but actually what difference did you make to the profession? How are you viewed by your colleagues and peers? It's voluntary, but every teacher wants to be part of this. That is, I think, something where I think we can do a lot better. So, as always, we score countries on this, and you can really see professional knowledge, professional autonomy, the collaborative culture, huge differences across countries. And countries come out well for different reasons. If you look to Estonia, why do they do so well? Because they're very, very strong on professional autonomy. Teachers are designers of innovative learning environments. That's the strength of Estonia. You go to the next country, Singapore. Why do they do so well? They are great on the collaborative culture. Every teacher has a well-functioning professional learning community, very well moderated, very scientific. They learn together to frame good practice. Similar in New Zealand. So different countries have different sources of professionalism. All three are important. Imagine you could combine the strengths of Estonia with the strengths of Singapore. You'd create the world's best education system. Mm-hmm. I want to just highlight the green aspect a little bit more, the professional collaboration. On the surface, a lot of things happening. Teachers share resources, they're very social people, they have a lot of incentives to sort of work together. But when it comes to the more deeper forms of professional collaboration, observing somebody else's classroom, doing sort of joint activities, look how rarely those things actually occur. Why do I say this? Well, in some countries, of course, it's more, but in most systems, not. Why do I say this? Because the more teachers jointly teach, the more they observe other classes, the more they engage in joint activities, take part in professional learning, collaborative professional learning, the greater their sense of effectiveness. Those things are not only driving practice, they also drive your own sense of efficacy. They also drive job satisfaction. It's the biggest predictor of job satisfaction across countries. It's not salaries, not class size, it's the kind of environment and work organization, whether you have sense of autonomy, where the combination of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture. It's the biggest driver of professionalism and the biggest sources of professional practice. So easy to do, but so you could see in reality, still not to do. Moving from, administrative control and accountability, that's the past, to actually more professional forms of work organization, shifting information sideways. Finding better ways for public and private to collaborate in education, integrating the world of work and learning in better ways. This is not about, parallel systems of public and private schools. They gain you very little. In fact, over the weekend I was giving a presentation to independent schools, and you discount for social background, and there is actually no difference. Actually, public systems often mostly come out better. It's not about parallel systems, public and private. It's really about how do we leverage what the private sector can bring into education, the experience of work-based learning, better anticipation of the evolution of skill demand. That's what enterprises are really, really good at. They're much better to look into the future and anticipate the evolution of labor demand than, we can typically be. There's a lot of potential to really reap, and some systems doing that work. And the last thing is to move, from this layering new sort of priorities on top of the system every few years when governments change, towards, better alignment of policies. This is tough in a democratic society. You have a new government, they want to do something new, they put something new on top. It is very difficult. But there are countries in the Western world, but also in countries like Japan, that in our kind of democratic cultures have achieved this. And they have achieved this largely, and I want to make this point here, they have achieved this largely because they have built a kind of non-partisan agenda around education. Not bipartisan, non-partisan. They create a whole of society process around what is really, really important to us. What do we want to develop? They create social buy-in. They find ways to lower the cost of political action, doing things that are really difficult, and they find ways to increase the cost of political inaction. Thank you very much.